Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the incredible story of how the United States government was actually built. We'll follow the path from a simple list of complaints against a king all the way to the creation of a foundational document that, still shapes the country today.
All right, let's jump right in. Here's our roadmap for today. First, the big breakup with Britain. Then, we'll look at the first attempt at a government and why it didn't work. After that, we'll see how they forged the Constitution, how it all works with power and parties, and finally, who actually gets the keys to the car, who gets to govern.
Our story really begins not with a grand plan for a new country, but with a growing list of problems. The American colonists had some major issues with the British crown, and things were really getting to a breaking point.
And listen, these weren't just small complaints. Think about it. People were being taxed without having any voice in the government that was taxing them. That's where we get that famous line, no taxation without representation. They were being forced to house soldiers in their own homes, their local governments were being shut down, their trade was choked off. It really felt like their most basic, fundamental rights were just being stripped away one by one.
So this is where things get really revolutionary. The Declaration of Independence wasn't just a list of complaints. It was a whole new philosophy for how a government should work. It basically said that power doesn't come from some divine right of a king. No, it comes from the people, and its main job is to protect their fundamental rights.
And at the heart of all this is this big idea of unalienable rights. What does that mean? It means these are rights you're born with. They are natural rights that no government can just decide to take away from you. This concept, which was a huge idea from the philosopher John Locke, became the absolute bedrock for the entire argument for independence.
So here's the crucial point, the real kicker. The Declaration of Independence was basically a breakup letter, built on this idea of a social contract. The colonists were saying, look, we had to deal with the British government. We agree to be governed, and in return, you protect our rights. By stomping all over those rights, the king had broken that contract. And because he broke the deal, they believed they had every right to start over and create a new government.
Okay, so they're independent. Now what? How do they actually try to govern themselves? Well, that brings us to the Articles of Confederation. And you have to remember, after fighting a war against a super powerful king, the absolute biggest fear for this new nation was creating another government just like it.
So their solution was the Articles of Confederation. It wasn't really a national government like we think of one today. It was much more like a league of friendship. All the real power stayed with the 13 states, and the central government was designed on purpose to be incredibly weak.
But yeah, that weakness, it turned out to be a fatal flaw, a total disaster, really. The national government couldn't raise money because it couldn't tax. It couldn't defend the nation because it couldn't raise an army. It couldn't even settle arguments between states because there were no national courts. The whole country was basically falling apart at the seams, and it became crystal clear that this system just was not going to work.
So the failure of the Articles basically forced everyone back to the drawing board. This kicked off a convention in Philadelphia and sparked one of the most important debates in all of American history. How do you build a better, stronger framework for this new nation?
And this led to a huge conflict. On one side, you had the Federalists. They were all for the new Constitution, arguing for a much stronger national government to actually defend the country and hold it together. But on the other side, you had the anti-Federalists. They were terrified that this new government would become way too powerful and just crush the very individual liberties they had just fought a war over, and they refused to sign on without a Bill of Rights to protect people. It was a huge debate about national power versus individual freedom.
So what was the solution? What was the big compromise that came out of all this fighting? It was this really innovative idea called federalism. Instead of choosing between a strong central government or strong state governments, they decided to do both. They created a system where power is shared and divided.
So here's a quick look at how that actually works. Some powers, like declaring war, that belongs only to the federal government. Others, like running elections, that's left to the states. And then some powers, like having court systems, are shared by both. It's a constant balancing act, even today.
So they finally create this new, kind of complex system. But how does it actually work in the real world, especially when it comes to elections and the power of your vote?
Well, right off the bat, the system had some major bugs. A huge crisis blew up in the election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson and his own running mate, Aaron Burr, ended up tied in the Electoral College. It was absolute chaos. So the solution was the 12th Amendment. It changed the rules so that electors cast separate votes for president and vice president, a fix that prevents that exact crisis from ever happening again.
And that idea of federalism, of states having their own power, is still very much alive today, especially when you look at elections. Since states get to set a lot of their own voting rules, the requirements can look different depending on where you are. So for instance, here are the modern rules for who gets to vote in Florida. It's a perfect example of how those big foundational decisions still directly affect who gets to participate in government.
All right, so for our last section, let's look at the other side of the coin. It's not just about who can vote, but it's also about who is allowed to run for office. The founders set up some pretty specific rules for who could hold public office at both the national and state levels.
So as you can see here, the Constitution basically lays out a ladder. To be in the House of Representatives, you got to be 25 years old and a citizen for at least 7 years. For the Senate, the bar is higher, 30 years old, 9 years of citizenship. And for the top job, the presidency, the requirements are the strictest. 35 years old, a 14-year resident, and you have to be a natural-born citizen.
Now let's compare that to what's required at the state level in Florida. The rules are different, right? There's a much bigger emphasis on local connection. For the state legislature, you only have to be 21, but you have to live in the district you want to represent and have been a Florida resident for 2 years. It really reflects that core principle of federalism. National office needs a national perspective, while state office demands a local one.
So we've gone on this whole journey, from a list of grievances against a king to a really complex, layered system of government that was built through intense, messy debate and compromise. And understanding how it was designed to solve the problems of its own time is the absolute key to asking the most important question of all, as this slide asks. What are the biggest challenges facing this 200-year-old system in our world today?